All right. Let's get started. Um, these new slides I have were a little bit hastily thrown together. Um, uh, and honestly, I don't know where I am in this series anymore, installment wise. I guess this would be like part 7. The thing of it is, this is an extension of and clarification of the ideas that I presented in the last installment. Probably more so than any of my other installments is going to assume familiarity with the foregoing. And, the title is a little playful or a little silly. Perhaps it shouldn't be because, like all the parts of this series, this is dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Mother Mary, pray for us. It is in some sense for her honor, in some proximate sense for her honor, that I am, making this argument at such length and going to such great pains to explain all the details, it's like an addendum to the previous series, which was itself an addendum. So I think when I said the addendum to the addendum, I was aware that it can kind of match the title, the addendum to, spelled the addendum, which leaves the two somewhat redundant. But the DATDA actually refers to disjunctive argument from theological difficulty. And the A is addendum. That was with the title of the previous one. So this is the DATD argument, more or less, the disjunctive argument from theological difficulty. I'm not going to explain myself too much in this one. I'm just going to presume a familiarity with what has gone before for the most part. All right. So, I think it might just be good to just read some of this stuff and then begin to explain. It may be a little harder to follow this way, but I don't know. I'd like to get the ideas out there in spoken form first. Eventually, I do think I will write it in a book, but before you really want to know what you're doing. To some extent, I'm still kind of exploring these things, but I'll just read this slide. Why the claim that you are competent to judge the facts of theology necessarily requires you to be able to ground the whole business in your own independently worked out systematic theology. From henceforward, I'm abbreviating that as an IWAST. If you claim the competence to judge theology for yourself, to judge the facts, the theological facts on the ground, then one of the following two things is necessarily true. Either the position that you say is true, the theological position, and hence ecclesiological position. In other words, this is a theological worldview with a number of details, or respects, and your communion or confession is based on adherence to these views, which are hypothetically the fullness of correct theology that has been articulated on earth in a public way, something like this. If you the position that you say is true is either gonna line up exactly with one of the existing options, like it's just gonna lead you to the already existing true church, or it doesn't. So in the latter case, it's like a novum, an innovation, and in a sense also a restoration, if you like, of the church, and it currently at least represents a church of one. In this latter case, it is obvious why the ability to claim that your position is true requires you to be able to ground the whole business in your own IWAST, because And having created a theological novum, this is effectively what you have done. In having created a church of one, what you've done is you've grounded all of your views in your own independently worked out systematic theology. In the former case, the case where you just independently discover for yourself the fullness of correct theology and happily find that it completely lines up with one of the existing church options, what is uncontroversially true at a minimum is that being able to say with 100% confidence that the fullness of correct theology lines up exactly with one of the existing options depends on your ability to ground the whole business in your own IWAST. This is because of, as we have already established in the Aircraft Manual Thought Experiment, AMTE, you can only know that one of the existing options or experts, as it was put in that scenario, is truer than another as a function of your own actual knowledge of first order theology or of the manual correspondingly in that analogy. Okay, I don't know why the words are really tiny on this slide. But it might be objected. What if that 100% confidence condition is not met? So in other words, the objection is, well, you're saying you have to ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology to be 100% confident, but that's not reasonable for anyone. So I'm not really claiming to do that. I'm just claiming that, I sort of use my reason to the best that I can, and then kind of make a Peircean abductive leap to the sort of best inference. So, and maybe I only claim to be able to say with 80% confidence that one of the existing options lines up with the actual fullness of correct theology. That claim would imply that I trust in my ability to ground the whole business in my own IWAST to some extent, or up to some level of theological detail, but I'm not making any unrealistic claims about my ability to ground the whole business in my own IWAST, or to ground it, to 100% accuracy. Very well. Then what is the other 20% comprised of? We may say it is comprised of gamble, but 80% is still a good chance, no? Yet, if it is improbable that you would be 100% likely to successfully ground the whole business in your own IWAST, it should also be improbable that you would be 80% likely to successfully ground the whole business in your own IWAST. So you keep pushing your claimed likelihood of being able to ground the whole business in your own IWAST down to ever smaller but more realistic percentages of trust in your own skill, taking on, with each operation, ever larger proportions of gamble. At a certain point, it becomes apparent that you are not all that likely to be right in absolute terms, because your confidence in your ability to successfully ground the whole business in your own IWAST is really only, for example, let's say 5%. This is the point, and this is what I covered in my previous installment regarding the implicit actual logic of non-Catholicism. This is the point where the non-Catholic is most likely to say something along the lines of, so what if my guess is unlikely to be correct? It's the best guess that I have. In relative terms, a 5% chance is 500% better than a 1% chance, which is, for example, the chance that my next best guess is correct. And isn't it the case that everyone, the Catholic included, is just forced to make their best guess based on first order theology? The concrete facts or givens of theology, if you will, the facts that we find on the ground in the reality that we actually happen to inhabit, regardless of how low said guesses' chances of success might be. But as we have explored in the Aircraft Manual Thought Experiment, it is not actually the case that everyone is forced to make their best guess based on their own knowledge of the manual or of first order theology, as the case may be. Because to the extent that the rumor's truth is possible, there is a different option, namely the option of betting against your knowledge of the manual / first order theology, and on the likelihood that provision will have been made for you despite your ignorance of first order theology, or because of it, and correspondingly, you're betting against your own ability to successfully construct the aircraft by following the manual's instructions, and on the likelihood that the show producers will have ensured that there would nevertheless be a way for you to successfully complete this challenge despite your inability to decipher the manual. As opposed to betting on your knowledge of first order theology / your knowledge of first order theology fueled doubt in any provision having been made, or otherwise unbelief fueled doubt. In other words, you're either doubting Catholicism / papal infallibility on theological grounds, or you're doubting it just because you don't think God would have made provision for us. You're admitting theology is real hard to get it all right, but in terms of like grounding it in your own independently worked out systematic theology, but you're just doubtful that God will have made a provision for us despite this difficulty. In our own case, which is the case of theism / Christianity per assumption, the only reason one would doubt in provision having been made despite the difficulty of theology is one's claimed knowledge of first order theology, since simple unbelief in God's provision, the only other logical alternative, is disallowed on normative grounds. So what this sentence means is that in our case, because we are good Christians who trust God, if our only givens are that theology is real hard, we don't know what we're doing, our best guess might be, Catholicism's false, because my best guess looks like Eastern Orthodoxy, except I don't hold that with any measure of actual confidence at all. I'm only like 1% sure of my chance of being right, or less even. Well then, I have to assume that some kind of provision has been made, because otherwise it's just I'm admitting I don't know what's going on, but God's not doing anything for us, and whatever doesn't come from faith is sin. One should make the assumption that God is making provision for us, and indeed everyone does make that assumption insofar as they suppose that there is some reliable stream of authority, and do not suppose that the fullness of correct theology has been lost to some significant extent, and suppose that it is necessary to bring about a restoration. The probability that the rumor is true is at least equal to, but in fact probably greater than, the state of affairs that I call I, and probability of I is the likelihood that one of the existing non-Catholic options is true, on the assumption that Catholicism is false. And another way to put this is that, the probability that the rumor is true in the aircraft manual thought experiment corresponds to what the probability of I would be if we could safely eliminate the possibility that God is willing to bring about papal infallibility, or just have, as it were, this magical knowledge that the Catholic stream of authority must be unreliable, while simultaneously somehow knowing that some other non-Catholic stream of authority must be reliable, which probability would be 100% to the extent that we are not unbelieving but believing. Like Jesus said, be not unbelieving but believing. So if you are doing the game of theology and all you really know is that it's really hard to figure out, you should not assume that God is not intervening to make it possible to find the truth of him relatively easily, because then otherwise your only hope of finding him is just like getting it all right on your own, and you have no meaningful guarantee. Well, to the extent that you doubt he would have made any provision, you're actually assuming more or less that the fullness of correct theology has been lost, at least to some very significant extent, and that it now falls on you to sort of bring about a restoration, sort of in a way similar to Mormonism or Joseph Smith. If you're doing theology and all you know is that it's really hard to do that all by yourself, you should assume God has been intervening, because the only reason why you wouldn't is just like simple unbelief in his goodness and his provision, more or less. So the probability that the rumor is not true is roughly equal to the likelihood that you succeed in being correct based on skill, that is, on your ability to ground everything in your own eyewash, plus, I suppose, the likelihood that whatever the probability of your being able to succeed in being correct based on skill might be, provision simply has not been made. And this likelihood in our actual case is slim to none, since we are supposed to be not unbelieving but believing. Hence, in our actual case, we can appreciate that the probability of the rumor is, for all intents and purposes, 1 minus S, where S represents one's ability to successfully ground the whole business in one's own eyewash. And we can also appreciate that if our grounds for rejecting the rumor aren't that we think we know better based on our knowledge of first order theology and or the manual, but because we simply don't know if we can trust like that. I don't trust like that. Like the car salesman says in the skit, when 3 men sitting atop, two of whom were sitting atop the shoulders of other men, dress in a trench coat and go into a car dealership. Anyway, that's kind of obscure, but if our grounds for rejecting the rumor aren't that we think we know better based on our knowledge of first order theology / the manual, but simply because we just doubt we just doubt he would have done for us. We're in the storm and we're just thinking, oh man, the boat is sinking. If that's true, then acting on the assumption that the rumor of the 10th man having some kind of direct link to the inventor of the aircraft, at least a kind of failsafe that prevents him ever building his aircraft incorrectly, or the W thesis, the thesis that God is willing to bring about papal infallibility, and hence, the doctrine of papal infallibility being true, because if it's possible and God is willing to do it, then he's going to do it because he's omnipotent. And we're assuming it is possible logically. It doesn't involve a necessary contradiction like a square circle. So then, acting on the assumption that the rumor /W /papal infallibility is not true does not obviously increase one's chances of success, but rather, to the extent that we cannot be certain that the rumor /W papal infallibility is false, decreases them, since that supposition corresponds to being in what I called case A, with just a higher threshold of accuracy / a smaller dartboard. So this requires quite a bit of explanation. It's rather compressed. So what I'm saying is, like, in this aircraft manual thought experiment, if you're assuming that there's definitely some way for you to make this make this aircraft safely and successfully, then and for you specifically, that no man will sort of be left behind, then the probability that the rumor is true is 1 minus S, where S is the ability for you to follow the aircraft manual instructions yourself. If it turns out to be really easy to do that, we don't really have any good reason to suppose that the rumor is necessarily true. Maybe it is true, but we don't know. And also, we don't have to take a chance on it being true, because the instructions are so easy to follow that we can just do it ourselves in either case. But in the case where the likelihood of S is really low, where we just really acknowledge we're confused as heck by the manual, but definitely there is some way for us to do it safely and successfully. Each individual man, you included, however dense you might be relative to everyone else, the probability of the rumor being true is 1 minus S. It's the same thing in our situation, to the extent that we are enjoined to be, not unbelieving but believing, and to take heed that everything that does not proceed from faith is sin. So we should assume there is a way. The logic of piety is saying that if finding the fullness of correct theology, or at least knowing where it is contained, and if being in the communion with the right people is important to God, he would have made a way for us to do it, despite our honest acknowledgement of our bafflement by theology. And what I am also saying is that if we admit we have zero ability to ground anything in our own iwast, but that we still just can't trust God like that realistically, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, then it's like we are in that situation that I called case A, where the blindfolded dart thrower, based on muscle memory, has a good chance of hitting the board as long as he knows he's faced in the right direction. But he just isn't sure that he is faced in the right direction, because somebody, some sort of participant in the game spun him around a few times to where he's really turned around now, but he's in fact so turned around that he's not even sure if he is actually turned around from where he was initially facing. And in that situation, you basically, either it's totally random, where you are. Either that person has spun you in such a way that your chance of facing the right direction is totally random, or you can suppose that, he has taken an interest in your hitting the target. And if we don't have faith that he had taken an interest in our hitting the target, then it's not as if we clearly have anything to lose by just acting on the slim chance that he has done, because otherwise our chances of hitting the target are just not very high. Now, if we knew for a fact that he actually didn't want us to reach the target, then our chances would be maximized by turning in any other direction, potentially, than the one in which we had been faced, unless he's using some kind of advanced game theory, kind of like the Princess Bride, where he face you in the right direction because he assumes that you assume that he will have placed you in the wrong direction. But barring all kinds of stuff like that, because we are not assuming that we know that, because we would only have a reason to believe that God is against us, or at least that papal infallibility is not true, if we could actually be confident in our ability to ground the whole business in our own IWAS, which we are not claiming. So from this position of agnosticism and humility, epistemic humility, we are just saying, well, it could be true that he faced us in the right direction or not. We just really don't know. But there's no downside to just throwing in the direction in which you've been faced, because you're just, in addition to the random chance you already have of hitting the dartboard, you are just assuming, you are just adding to that the likelihood, whatever it is, the non-zero likelihood that the person who spun you around has an interest in your hitting the target. Unbeknownst to everyone, he has taken a bet on you hitting the target or something like that, and someone whispered a rumor of that to you before you started the game. I don't know. You can get crazy with it, but it's not that hard to tease out the logic. So what I'm saying is the real only reason you would doubt papal infallibility or the rumor being true is like in an aircraft manual thought experiment terms, if you just realize, no, that I know this manual so good that this man claiming to have a special relationship with the warehouse owner or the aircraft inventor or whatever, he can't be telling the truth, because I know based on my knowledge of the manual that he's building it wrong. So in other words, in AMTE terms, this latter likelihood corresponds to the likelihood of one's being able to call BS on the rumor, because one can tell from one's knowledge of the manual that the rumored man is building his aircraft wrong. And or simple lack of trust in the show's producers, because one views them as malicious or ill-intentioned, which we would never really suppose in God's case. So that's only a thinkable thought in the AMTE scenario. It cannot be argued that the likelihood that the rumor is not true is equal to S plus some notionally non-negligible chance that one of the non-Catholic authority streams must be reliable, because to say that one of the non-Catholic options must represent a reliable stream of authority because you are competent to judge theology, and that you are competent to judge theology because of the because one of the existing non-Catholic options represents a reliable stream of authority, is viciously circular. It would be like saying, well, I know the rumor is false. Why? Because I know the manual at least well enough to know that the rumor is false. All the 9 other experts are making their own in a different way than he is. And he's doing something none of them are doing, and they're all doing something he is not doing. And I know that those 9 experts are right, and the rumored man is blowing smoke. Okay, how do you know that? Well, because of my knowledge of the manual. It's like, okay, how are you so sure in your knowledge of the manual? Oh, because these experts all told me these are the assumptions you should make while reading the manual, and you should understand that the diagrams point to this and not that. And that is viciously circular. In a way that is unprincipled. One can claim that instead some virtuous circle or spiral dynamic is in play here rather than a vicious one. So let's imagine that, there's this other, in the beginning, I don't know anything, but there's this expert who says, hey kid, you can trust me based on what I know. And I'll tell you, read the manual like this and build your aircraft like this, and you'll just get it. Everything will start snapping together, both, physically in front of you and in your head. You'll just have the subjective sense of, it's making sense. I'm figuring this out. And so, in other words, you trust him. You first go to this guy because it's like, well, I don't really get the manual, but I think it's saying this, so I think I'm going to go to this guy. And this guy, expert number 3 or something, expert number 3 says, yeah, so you're coming to me, well, you have good taste, well, you should do the following next steps, D, E, and F, do those steps, right? And so I do that, and now things get even more clear to me. It's like, oh, I get it now, and I understand more of the manual, and that makes me understand more of what this expert is doing. That makes me trust him more, so that when he says, okay, now do GH and I, I'm trusting that, right? And so it's like what's enabling me to know here isn't my ability to understand the manual all by myself, but it's a kind of virtuous circle where theology kind of opens out. It's obscure at first, but once you enter into it through the right doorway, a vista kind of opens up and things become clearer and clearer. All right. But now this is the question. How does one know that this is indeed what the dynamic is, rather than a potentially vicious circle enabled by the extreme difficulty of theology, where we may suppose that theology is so hard that you can be really wrong about it, while simultaneously feeling really convicted that you are right and that everything is snapping together, etc. Because note that the claim to knowledge here is actually only really stemming from a subjective sense of things making sense to you and being confident in yourself. If it turns out, it would be one thing, say, if you're the only person who had this sense and everyone else felt clueless and like they were doing it wrong, like it just the parts weren't fitting. But if it was the case that different people following different experts, and some people even following the rumored man, also had this sense as well, and as far as you could tell, it looked to be equally intense as your own, then you cannot be totally sure that this is actually a virtuous circle. Maybe it's a vicious circle, because apparently this business is so difficult that a lot of people can't even actually realize that it is difficult. And it seems like all else equal, a system where you don't have a kind of reliable intuitive feedback as to whether you're doing it right or wrong, and can even feel like you're right when you're doing it wrong, is harder, all else equal, than a system in which you can at least have this kind of internal intuitive feedback, because we can suppose that in this AMTE that these parts are some kind of weird alien Lego that you can just kind of, they snap together and look right, and feel right, in multiple different configurations, but per assumption there's only one actual correct way to do this, and there's like hardly any margin for error. And in theology, what we do find is that, folks in Eastern Orthodoxy, they go into it and they say it makes sense from this perspective. I caught the phronema of the church, and theology has opened up, and now theology makes me understand, church life better, and then that in turn helps me understand theology more deeply. But you must understand that people who are like, what are they called? Dominican monks studying Thomistic theology often have this sense. People who study Reformed theology often have this sense, oh, it just makes sense now. Dispensationalism, especially this kind of system-based theologies, which I'm not arguing Eastern Orthodoxy to be particularly, but it's true that people often have this sense in vastly different churches with vastly different systems, Calvinism and dispensationalism and all these just different things. Almost anything you might care to name, really. I guess there are some denominations where everyone in there is kind of casual about the theology. I'm thinking perhaps of, what are they called? Episcopalians or Methodists, but I don't know, maybe you might, or Presbyterianism to some extent, but then again, you might find the actual sort of theologically convicted Presbyterian like Redeem Zoomer or Douglas Wilson, and they say, oh yeah, this is the only system that makes sense to me. I get it in this paradigm, but none of the others, Anyway, I would say that based on this empirical observation, that people seem to feel this way about their own different and mutually exclusive positions, that we should assume that the dynamics being a vicious circle as opposed to a virtuous circle is at least possible. And we should also note a double dissociation here, where some people enter the Eastern Orthodox Church, and while they are there, presumably, but not necessarily, catching the same phronema as everybody else, they become theologically convicted that a different system is correct. They might become Catholic because suddenly the Filioque makes better sense to them. If you don't think such people exist, look harder, because they're out here on YouTube sharing their testimonies, like Ben Bollinger and the person who refers to himself as the Cathodox. Or they might even theoretically go back to being Protestant because they still think Catholicism is wrong because papal infallibility is wrong, because there's too many contradictions in the papal record. But the Eastern Orthodoxy is wrong on the Filioque, for example, or on something else, and it claims to be right about everything, and so it can't be correct, and so they go to being Protestant because neither Catholicism nor Eastern Orthodoxy is correct as far as they're concerned. So again, it's a double dissociation. That would tell me that we should at least pay serious attention, or give serious credibility to the possibility that theology is really just that hard, that it doesn't even always feel hard, even though you're wrong, and that it's a vicious circle. So the only extent to which one can be confident that one is genuinely on the scent of truth, rather in some kind of feedback loop of error, which may be on some macro level of scale, if you catch my meaning, nonetheless kind of rhymes with the truth or contains an echo or kernel of it, if you know what I mean. Because I do think that somebody who gets deep into Calvinism, for example, will be wrong, but they will nonetheless sort of happen upon an appreciation of the sovereignty of God, which might not be present in certain other traditions. So it's not like they're totally wrong on a formal level, even though they are technically wrong on a content level, if that makes sense. It can rhyme with the truth if you can roll with this phraseology. So the only extent to which we can be confident that one is genuinely on the scent of truth rather than in some kind of feedback loop of error is the extent to which we can know that we are correct. That is, it is the extent to which we can ground everything in our own independently worked out systematic theology. Yeah, that's the only way we can really be sure that we're not in a vicious circle. In AMTE terms, we may suppose that the aircraft being assembled is so alien and strange that the different self-styled experts and their respective partisans can feel completely certain, even to the point of anger and blows, that they are each building the aircraft the right way and everyone else is building it the wrong way, despite the fact that everybody else seems equally certain and everyone is obviously building their respective aircrafts in markedly different ways. We may suppose that the aircrafts in question are made of some kind of weird or alien Lego that can be arranged seemingly unproblematically or plastically in quite a few different ways, or at least in ways that seem unproblematic until they are put to the test on flight day. Not that God is going to punish you for honest mistakes. I don't believe that for a second. That's just an analogy. But we don't want, ideally, all else equal, to be honestly mistaken. We want to make our best effort at being right. So, and then I got some asterisks over here. What were they asterisks of? I'll explain whenever I. Oh yeah. Because I made a big claim. I said I said W, or the idea that God is willing to make papal infallibility true, is actually should be seen as at least equally likely, but probably more likely than what I called I, which is the probability that, well, Catholicism is definitely false, but one of the non-Catholic streams of authority is reliable, such that even though Catholicism is false, you don't have to ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology to be right. You have some chance of guessing right, even if you don't know what you're doing, because one of the existing non-Catholic options is definitely going to be right. That's what I says, more or less. So that even if you had no S, you had no skill, you would still have some significant chance of being right, because of this I proposition. But, and in the manual terms, this is like saying, well, I is the probability that the rumor is definitely false, but one of those 9 experts is right. So in the end of the day, even if I don't understand the manual at all, I have some, even if I'm honest about the fact that if it were up to me and my own knowledge of the manual, I would have no chance of making this work. I still have like a 1 in 9 chance of being right based on following one of these experts, like just choosing one at random and following them like they are the Pope, more or less. So the thing is, what makes this I assumption likely to be true? Well, it's because God wouldn't want it to all rest on your own discernment where that is lacking. Because it's like, why? Because he wants you to have a chance of being right. Well, okay, it's as long as we're supposing that God is intervening providentially to make it easier that you have a chance of being right. Why would you suppose that he succeeds only partially? Why wouldn't you suppose that he succeeded wholly? It's somehow doable for God to make one of the churches that exists at a given time always be right, but it's not necessarily always the same church. It's almost like whack-a-mole. Is it that's easy for God, but it's too hard for God to make it so that the same church kept being right, the one that had some kind of obvious marker of authority, such that, because you could say, well, no, God always made sure the Eastern Orthodox Church was always right, but the only way you would know it is if you had that kind of theological discernment or you just happen to guess right. Anyway, point being, so long as we are supposing that he is intervening at all for the reason of making it easier to find the church, I do not know how that makes I more likely than W. I would think, if anything, it makes W a lot more likely than I, because I would assume God is, if he's intervening for some purpose, he's more likely to achieve that purpose 100% rather than partially. Like, what is 1 in 9? 11%. Because if I is true but your S is 0, then you have only an 11% chance. It's like his provision only resulted in you having an 11% chance, whereas if the rumor is true and S is 0, you have 100% chance of being right, by taking that leap of faith and trusting, the relevant external guide. And what, again, this is highlighting is the only reason we would doubt W is if we actually, perceive ourselves as competent to judge the theological facts on the ground. Remember that the question of our theological competence is logically prior to our guess as to what direction the theological facts point in, and B, see in the theological facts strong empirical or a posteriori grounds to doubt W or the rumor, however otherwise pleasant those fictions might be to believe. And it's also highlighting the inherent logic of non-Catholicism, which, once you force it to be honest about the actual difficulty of theology, is not going to say I have some really good reason to suppose that that papal infallibility is not true, but is going to say instead that, well, or it's not going to say that I have some absolute confidence that my guess is right. It's just that it's my best guess, and we all have to make our best guess based on our own knowledge of the manual / theology. But if you've seen the previous installments in my series, you know that that is not true. Let me just pause here for 1 second. I am unfortunately under something of a time crunch, but the other thing that I was going to say was that the other kind of potential non-Catholic move that frequently gets made is sort of like, well, even though I'm not supposing papal infallibility is true, and even though I'm acknowledging that theology is really hard and I wouldn't be able to get all of it right by myself, nevertheless, I think I have a reasonable chance of being right enough based on my own best guess, because I am sure that in the end, really only a few theological things matter, such that it is truly safe to not have a position on the things that don't matter, or to have a wrong position on the things that don't matter, just as safe as it would be as if I, had the right position on all the other issues of theology, even those that do not matter. And the question is sort of, if this would be like in case A, if it's a blindfolded dart thrower, but the dart board actually turns out to be really huge, or there's like multiple dart boards, so that, he has a 75% chance of hitting. It's a circular room, by the way. I don't know if I explained that. So these are in some sense perhaps concave, geometrically concave, or Lobachevskian dartboards. But theoretically, he has just a really good chance of hitting one of the dartboards unbeknown to him, even if he just throws in some random direction. But see, the point to observe there is that to the extent that you acknowledge yourself theologically ignorant, there is no downside to just assuming you have been faced in the right direction. Unless, again, you have, like, as it were, magical knowledge that the rumor is false. You must face some direction other than the one in which you have been turned. And in that case, the question then arises, on what principled basis do you have such, can you make such a specific claim? Because to actually arrive at that in a principled way is going to require you to lean ever more dangerously on your own, theoretical ability to ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology. Let me see. So in some sense, maybe the right flow for this whole business, because what it's really getting at on a big picture level is sort of, how do we know the things of theology? Is it authority, or is it figuring it out intellectually? And really, to the extent that God is not a finite and tractable something like geometry, but is instead, which is finite to the extent that it is defined as a subject, in distinction to other subjects. It's a limited, representing only a limited portion of reality. To the extent that God is actually living and personal, and that the truths of special revelation cannot be revealed in any other way except through his own designated authorities, we are totally at the mercy of, or otherwise direct personal revelation, such that we are totally at the mercy of his own self-disclosure. And I talked in the previous installment about the problems that arise with assuming that it's all about direct personal revelation between God and you. To the extent that God is living and personal and not able to actually be intellectually figured out, it suggests that there's going to have to be some kind of reliable authority, actually. And non-Catholicism assumes this as much as everybody else. They just really, most of the time, also operate on the assumption that although one of the choices is reliable, you must thereafter use reason to find out which one it is. Whereas if Catholicism is true, you never have to lean on your own theological discernment to find out which church is true. So you're just betting on whether the thing is structured in such a way that you don't have to lean on your own reason, or it is. And depending on how hard it is to actually lean on your own reason and how much trust you have in God to make provision for you in spite of it being difficult to lean on your own reason, if that's what it turns out to be, then you're just betting on these two things. In effect, you're betting on your theological competence, or you're betting against it. And so, yeah, on a big picture level, it's like, is this done intellectually or through authority? I think all the real serious Christians are saying it's through authority, and it's like, okay. It turns out there's only one principled way to do it all from authority. It just requires you to actually set little store by your own theological assumptions or convictions that stem from your own perceived theological competence, which I think you should lack competence in your own ability to the extent that you recognize that, for example, you wouldn't have been able to come up with something that sufficiently approximates the doctrine of the Trinity on your own, because indeed it looks like none of the church fathers ever clearly did prior to Nicaea, and maybe even after, for a little bit. And you just got to be realistic about whether you could have done it all on your own, because if you just take all the defined positions that exist now and just kind of imagine yourself to be sort of reverse engineering the truth from one of them, in all likelihood you are guessing more than you are actually skilling. The only way to be really sure you would be right would be able to sort of being able to sort of independently reproduce all of theology on your own from a very limited set of givens, that which say existed at the beginning of church history, that the fathers were working with. And you got to be right about everything. You got to be right about the canon. You got to be right about Trinity. You got to be right about Christology. You got to be right about how many wills does he have. Assuming these are all things that matter enough that you should break communion over them or not. Now, again, there's always the possibility to just say, well, they don't really matter. Not even the Trinity, maybe even. I'll be just as fine with the Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, if it turns out that it's like that, it'd be safe with Catholicism too, unless, again, you have some really firm principled basis for excluding Catholicism, or else you have like just this magical knowledge that Catholicism is definitely false. All right. So Catholicism, the only principled way to do it, actually, to rest the whole case on authority from start to finish. And let me see, because it's like, if you're going the skill route, either you have the ability to ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology, or if you're striking out on your own, then either you have the ability to rest everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology, or you're making a completely circular guess, presupposing the authority of one of the alternative authorities, because the virtuous circle, which might exist in the middle, or as a third option, we explored the problems of that. And so at the end of the day, we only really have reason to doubt Catholicism/papal infallibility to the extent that we can trust in our own independently worked out systematic theology. It does not do to point to the authority of some non-Catholic tradition as one's reason for knowing that Catholicism is false. And so I think where we're appropriately humble about our ability to ground the whole business in our own independently worked out systematic theology, we have to realize that at a minimum, we are in case A. We are so turned around that we don't even actually know if we are turned around. We don't know that we are not facing the right direction. We do not know that the rumor is not true. We may not be sure that papal infallibility is true or that God is willing to make it a thing, but we are also not sure that he is unwilling. And so if you had to rest it all on your own judgment and really assume the real possibility that everybody could be wrong, either you assume everybody is in fact wrong, or you assume that this stuff is so important that you have to have a high measure of confidence with your guests, so that you really have to lean on your own understanding to reconstruct the whole business in your own independently worked out theology. Well, whenever we try to do this and see how hard this is, we kind of realize there's almost no relationship between the effort we put into the endeavor and the accuracy of our resultant guess, because we just truly have no idea what we're doing. And so there is a way that assuming that we are not faced in the right direction is almost without any practical import or any real implication for action. And we can never deny the possibility that we are in fact faced in the right direction. So if we throw in the direction that we're already facing in, or assume that the rumor is true, or assume that God is willing to make papal infallibility a thing, and hence that it is a thing, it is a reality, then we at least have sort of, in addition to whatever random chance we had of being right just on our own, because the blind dart thrower is not even sure that he's going to miss. The only thing he's sure of is that he's blind. But in addition to the whatever random minuscule chance you had of being right, or not necessarily minuscule if the dartboard is actually really big, but in addition to whatever random chance you had of being right, you also have the chance that God is helping you. The person who turned you around is helping you try to hit it. And that's just game theoretically, as it were, dominant. It's the dominant strategy. It's the one that on either supposition there's no downside to it. In the case where it's not true, and in the case where it is true, there's a lot of upside. It's a little bit like Pascal's wager, which I explored the connections between the disjunctive argument for theological difficulty and Pascal's wager in previous installments. But let me go back to this thing. All right. Yeah, and again, this other footnote says, even if one can't help but feel some raw level of doubt, I believe, help my unbelief. If that is the only reason one doubts the rumors being true, like as opposed to actual skepticism toward Catholicism based on your own independently worked out systematic theology, then we are at worst in case A with a low threshold of accuracy, in which case throwing straight ahead still represents one's dominant strategy, since we have no specific grounds to doubt papal infallibility or Catholicism. So point being, Catholicism represents one's... See, I guess, what is the flow? I wrote it down. Sorry, I'm all over the place. Just a second. Okay, I think this is the sort of flow chart, as it were. It's either necessarily papal infallibility or not necessarily papal infallibility. Let's answer not necessarily. So we're either competent to judge theology or not, and let's say realistically we're not. God is not a thing that you can really figure out as a one-man army or something, a one-man university. So we're not competent. Okay, is it that? So we're basically in case A, and so but is it the case that there is a high threshold of accuracy or a low one? In other words, is it the case that the dartboard is tiny, or that it's huge? Either way, your safest bet is Catholicism, to the extent that you recognize yourself to be a sort of theological ignoramus. In the previous installment, I gave the example to illustrate the prior the logical priority of the assessment of one's own theological competence over the determination of which direction the theological facts actually point to, which church they point to. Because I said, like, it could be that, in the AMTE scenario, my best read of the manual is I should make the aircraft like this. Then it turns out they bring the inventor of the show out. The show brings the inventor of the aircraft out, and he shows his own take on how the model should look. And in that case, I am very quick to abandon my best guess in favor of how he says it should look, despite the fact that the one I produced does represent my best guess as to how it should look based on my own understanding of the manual. It doesn't matter if I don't have it doesn't matter that is my best guess if I don't have a high assessment of my own theological competence. So that's really what it's resting on. To the extent that you doubt your own ability to reconstruct this whole business on your own, you must bet in the direction of Catholicism, because the other way to see this is that it's the only consistent bet in the direction of authority, because everyone else is presupposing that, well, perhaps blind submission to one's ultimate ecclesial superior was valid up until a certain point, but after that, it necessarily then did become a matter of one's own ability to rest everything on your own theological judgment. And you can say, well, it's still leaning on your own theological judgment to say that it wouldn't have all leaned on that. And that's kind of true, but it's not in a first order sense. So in other words, if I'm confused about a physics lecture, my knowledge that I'm confused is not a claim to knowledge of the actual physics content. Similarly, if I'm confused about theology and I suppose that therefore there must be a non-reason-based way of doing this, that is a claim to knowledge, but it's not a claim to specific theological knowledge. That's why I say first order theology, because this is, in a sense, it's theology, but it's second order. It's more meta or abstract. It's the kind of knowledge Socrates has when he says, all I know is that I know nothing. It's not a claim to specific kinds of knowledge. Now let me go back to my slides in case there was anything that I missed. All right. I'll just read these. So in the approach I talked about in the last installment, we say that you can claim to ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology, or you should admit that your whole approach is circular and it's just really based on your assumption that even though you don't have a high chance of being right, you just have to lean on your own understanding, faute de mieux, for lack of a better alternative. And we demonstrated at length in the beginning of the Theological Difficulties series why this is actually not true. And the class and this sort of approach that I took last time will just say that, hey, it's not like you only have this option, there's another option, and it makes sense for you to bet on it, and there is no downside to betting on it. To the extent that you have some chance of being right by choosing at random, to that extent, you also have the same chance of being right using this approach of throwing straight ahead in the direction you are already facing, as far as we can tell. And because it's case A, we're effectively in case A, as long as we're throwing in some random direction, any direction will do. So might as well bet in the direction that gives you some additional probability of being right, because it's a non-zero chance that you've been turned in the right direction, because you can't actually rule out the possibility you've been turned in the right direction, even though you can't rule it in. All right. But the non-Catholic apologists will say there's a third option. What if our claim to knowledge is not viciously circular, like the person who says, well, it's expert number 8, and how do I know? Because of my knowledge of the manual. And how do I know that I do understand the manual as well as I think I do? Because expert number 8 assures me that I do. That's viciously circular. The non-Catholic apologists can say, rather than it being viciously circular along these lines, it's virtuously circular to where theology opens up, and so what was at first opaque, once you enter it, it becomes clear. And then I sort of raise the question, to what extent can knowledge, i.e. a principled basis, or a justified true belief, a principled basis for claiming what you claim, to what extent can that be circular? And that's an interesting question, because there is going to be, at the end of the day, that necessary degree or to which, or sense in which, any epistemic perspective is circular. But let's explore that further. But what I want to ask right now is not this claim actually trading implicitly entirely just on some kind of subjective sense that one is right? And then you should be troubled if there are others who seemingly have that same subjective sense. I mean, you can't know that the intensity of your own inner subjective knowing exceeds theirs. It's not possible. I mean, I guess you can guess if they look really uncertain and you know that you're not uncertain. That would be one thing, but they may look as certain as you, which empirically seems to be our situation, but whatever. So, all right. Well, I said this criterion of having this kind of inner sense of knowing is not such that it produces intersubjective agreement, or the idea that we should choose among theological worldviews based on which gives us the sense of things snapping together. We know that this criterion doesn't produce intersubjective agreement, because different folks will choose different positions, because different positions will give them the subjective sense of things snapping together. I mean, but then again, you could just say it's because they haven't done what we've done. But you can also point to the phenomenon of people who are knowledgeable, say, about whatever brand of theology, Reformed theology, Eastern Orthodoxy, that you subscribe to, and then left. And so this is the double dissociation that I mentioned. And you can ask, what was going on with them? And it's like, well, clearly they didn't have that inner subjective sense of certainty. I mean, is that what the whole business is really supposed to rest on? You're just supposed to feel it, and if you don't feel it, there's something wrong with you. And it's like, the question is, how can we assume that some subjective sense that one is on the scent of truth is guaranteed to mean that you are on the scent of truth? I mean, sometimes it can mean that, and sometimes it doesn't, right? So I'm not really sure why we have to assume that. See, this is, I'm sorry, this is incredibly unprofessional, but this is just a transcription of a voice memo I left to myself. Somehow, I don't know if I work best using this method, but it's the easiest. So I'm not really sure, and I often don't have time to actually sit down and write or record. So sometimes that's what I have to do. So I'm not really sure why we have to assume that. I mean, I would get it if everyone was more or less in this position, but as we've already noted ad nauseum, that's not the case. And so it is the case that what the argument is just to point out. Oh, okay. Sorry, excuse me. So here's a move that one could make. You could make a kind of pre-sup move and just note the necessary sense in which every epistemic position is ultimately circular. But the thing about that I would ask is, isn't it the case that we have to prefer whatever circular position is more explanatorily comprehensive than another or the others? Because if that's not your criterion for ruling out other possible circular positions, what is? Because you have to have a criterion for that. It's not simply because someone else makes a circular argument for a different position that you have to appreciate that it's a great argument simply because it's circular. There must be some rational principle that lets you decide which circular perspective makes more sense, or does a better job of explaining all the data, has a greater comprehensiveness. I will, if I have to cite if someone told me to cite my sources here, the site that I would the source that I would cite for this is none other than Christopher Langan, supposedly the smartest person in the world, and a kind of a maverick philosopher with a maverick autodidact philosopher with very controversial views. You can think what you want about him. I do not subscribe to all his views. I subscribe to the moral and dogmatic views of the Catholic Church. But he is the person from whom I got this knowledge. And so anyway, so in this case, with the data that we have, here is the question. Despite your claim that it is a virtuous circle, I do observe that some people who were Eastern Orthodox catechumens leave, for example, and I do observe that other people in different traditions, Thomism, Reformed theology, etc., they also seem to have this subjective sense of everything just snapping together and everything being so clear. And how could anyone think otherwise? My explanation for this is that theology is so hard that you might not even always know that it's actually hard. You might feel like you're right and actually be wrong. In other words, theology is so hard that you won't always even feel like you're wrong when you are wrong. The thing that you don't even always know if you're wrong on it is theoretically harder than the thing where you always do, at least in some way, all other respects being equal. But so that's my explanation for why we have these double dissociative data of catechumens leaving Eastern Orthodoxy, say, and Thomists and Reform bros feeling all subjectively certain about mutually exclusive positions. There ought to be a term for Thomist bros, because they do seem to exist as a species as well. You have an explanation for that too, but it's circular. I know they're wrong because my theology is right. I know my theology is right because of my subjective sense of certainty, etc. But that position offers no valid basis for choosing your position rather than a different one, because others also have a subjective sense of certainty associated with them. And whereas my position, it does have a basis for being chosen as against a different view. It's not only resting on some subjective inner certainty. My position is going to say theology is real hard, so that unless you can ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology, you should acknowledge that you're more or less choosing at random. You cannot ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology, but there is the possibility, in case A, that you are so turned around that you don't even know if you're actually turned away from the dartboard. But there is the non-zero chance that the rumor is true, that whoever was spinning you around has placed a bet on your hitting the target, unbeknown to the organizers of the game or other participants in the game, we may suppose. So he has some interest in it, in your hitting the target. So he has faced you toward the target and kind of whispered in your ear that he's facing you toward the target as he spins you. Now, do you trust him? And you can never rule that out. And otherwise, if it's just totally random, your chance of hitting in that direction is as good as any others. So might as well throw in that direction, because you get whatever non-zero random chance there is originally, plus the non-zero chance that the rumor is true. This is what my position says to do. It is accounting for all of the data. And the question is there another perspective that I ought just as reasonably to adopt other than mine based on this kind of rationale? And there is none. So again, to recap, your position is circular and it does not account for the double dissociative data that I mentioned. And therefore, as a result, your position doesn't actually offer any principled basis for you to select your position. You don't have a principled basis for selecting your position as against another position. It's an unprincipled decision. It's violating the principle of sufficient reason. And the thing about the principle of sufficient reason is, if we question it and we say, well, why should I believe that the principle of sufficient reason is a thing? Well, if you ask that question, you're presupposing that things are true for reasons and hence need a reason in order to be, believed. And my position does account for data X, Y, and Z. And then that means that there is a principled basis for choosing my perspective rather than yours or somebody else's. So again, to note that every perspective is ultimately somewhat circular is fair, I would agree. But unless there is some criterion that lets us decide among which perspectives are better and which ones are worse, I don't see what prevents us from having to accept every circular argument that's made just because it's circular, which we never do. We correctly note the fallacious way in which those perspectives beg the question. And so how can both be true? Because I'm agreeing that there is that circularity at the bottom of any position. but at the same time, ordinarily, most of the time, begging the question is a fallacy. So I'm offering a grounds that lets you sort among positions, namely saying that given that each perspective is circular, you should choose the one that has the greater explanatory comprehensiveness. And you can say, well, the Eastern Orthodox position is more self-consistent. It makes more theological sense internally. That only presupposes theological competence, which I say you should only assume you have if you're actually confident in your ability to have gotten the whole thing right without relying on any authority. So I'm offering a grounds to let you sort among positions, namely that the comprehensiveness of a perspective, which one explains more of the data, is in fact the criterion that we do use. And if that is not your grounds, which one do you use? Because if you're one who is like a presuppositional apologist who recognizes and kind of leans on the way in which every epistemic perspective is ultimately circular, you theoretically must also have some criterion for, deciding which circular view to adopt, because they're all circular, but we also recognize in certain contexts that vicious circularity is a fallacy and a begging of the question in a way that is problematic. So I would again suggest that following Chris Langen, comprehensiveness is the metric that you use to decide that. I am, as I said, pressed for time, so this is going to have to be it. Thank you for watching and listening. Father God, I pray in Jesus' name for all those who have listened to this. Please protect them and guide them and let them enter into the fullness of your positive will and your vision for their life and mine. And if you have watched this, thank you, and please pray for me because I need it.